I don't know if saw this, but it's super, super, super scary. I'm going to play this for you. You might not know the context, but this is Donald Trump today.
We sent in the U.S. Marshals. Took 15 minutes, it was over. 15 minutes, it was over. We got him. They knew who he was. They didn't want to arrest him. In 15 minutes, that ended. Anyway, and they called themselves peaceful protesters.
You wonder what Trump is talking about? Once I read a little bit more to you, Trump basically just admitted that the United States Marshals, potentially on his command, went in and just executed an American citizen on American soil with no trial, no jury, just executed. If you don't know what I'm talking about, buckle up. This is from the New York Times. Michael Reinhall was on the run. A few days after a shooting left a far-right Trump supporter dead on the streets of Portland, Oregon, Mr. Reinhall, an Antifa activist who had been named in the news media as a focus of the investigation, feared that vigilantes were after him, not to mention the police. Even some of his close friends didn't know where he was, but the authorities knew. On September 3rd, about 120 miles north of Portland, Mr. Reinhall was getting into his Volkswagen station wagon when a pair of unmarked sport utility vehicles roared through the quiet streets, screeching to a halt just in front of his bumper. Members of a U.S. Marshals task force jumped out and unleashed a hail of bullets that shattered windows, whizzed past bystanders, and left Mr. Reinhall dead in the street. Attorney General Bill Barr trumpeted the operation as a significant accomplishment that removed a, quote, violent agitator. The officers had opened fire, he said, when Mr. Reinhall, quote, attempted to escape arrest and produced a firearm during the encounter. Oh, I've heard this story before. But a reconstruction of what happened that night, based on the accounts of people who witnessed the confrontation and the preliminary findings of investigators, produces a much different picture. One that raises questions about whether law enforcement officers made any serious attempt to arrest Mr. Reinhall before killing him. In interviews with 22 people who were near the scene, all but one said they did not hear officers identify themselves or give any commands before opening fire. In their official statements, not yet made public, the officers offered differing accounts of whether they saw Mr. Reinhall with a weapon. One told investigators he thought he saw Mr. Reinhall raise a gun inside the vehicle before the firing began, but two others said that they didn't. Mr. Reinhall did have a .380 caliber handgun on him when he was killed, according to the county sheriff team that is running a criminal homicide investigation into his death. But the weapon was found in his pocket. An AR-style rifle was found apparently untouched in a bag in his car. 5 eyewitnesses said in interviews that the gunfire began the instant the vehicles arrived. None of them saw Mr. Reinhall holding a weapon. A single shell casing of the same caliber as the handgun he was carrying was found inside his car. Garrett Lewis, who watched the shooting begin while trying to get his 8-year-old son out of the line of fire, said the officers arrived with such speed and violence that he initially assumed they were drug dealers gunning down a foe, until he saw their law enforcement vests. Quote, I respect cops to the utmost, but things were definitely in no way, shape, or form done properly. The U.S. Marshal Service declined to comment for this article, citing the pending investigation. The agency previously said that it attempted to, quote, peacefully arrest Mr. Reinhall and that he had threatened the lives of law enforcement officers. Trump, who has described the racial justice protests that have roiled the nation as the work of lawless criminals, praised the operation. This guy was a violent criminal and the U.S. Marshals killed him, the president told Fox News. And I'll tell you something, that's the way it has to be. There has to be retribution when you have criminals like this. The shot felt like the beginning of a war. Mr. Reinhall had joined protesters in Portland in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing by the Minneapolis police in May, writing online that they were waging a necessary war with the potential to, quote, fix everything. He devoted himself to Black Lives Matter movement and once touted himself as 100% Antifa, all the way. 48 years old, he was a contractor and professional snowboarder, had run into trouble with the law in June when he was cited for driving under the influence of a controlled substance and having an unlicensed firearm in the car. Later, during the protest, the police arrested him and cited him for carrying a loaded firearm in a public place, but prosecutors dropped the charges. When the protests against the police got underway in Portland, he carved a niche for himself, providing security, watching for agitators. After a caravan of supporters of Mr. Trump arrived in Portland on August 29th and began clashing with protesters, a security camera showed Reinhold keeping an eye on one of them. Aaron J. Danielson, a supporter of the far-right group Patriot Prayer, who was walking with a can of bear repellent and an expanded baton. Seconds later, a separate live stream video captured Mr. Danielson being shot, and the Oregonian newspaper reported later that Mr. Reinhold was under investigation in the case. In an interview, while he was in hiding that Vice News broadcasted on September 3rd, Mr. Reinhold said he had fired in self-defense. Quote, "That shot felt like the beginning of a war," he said. On the day the interview aired, officers with the U.S. Marshals Pacific Northwest Violent Offender Task Force met for an intelligence briefing. The team, which included a mix of federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, already knew that Reinhold was staying in a brick complex of apartments in Lacey, Washington. The task force had information from an informant passed on by the Portland police about his location and possession of firearms, said Lieutenant Ray Brady of the Thurston County Sheriff's Office. I'm going to skip around. Mr. Reinhold left the apartment and walked towards his Volkswagen, parked along the street roughly 100 feet away. Two officers positively identified him, who proceeded to start the car, said Lieutenant Brady, who shared some of the initial findings of the investigation with the New York Times. They decided to make an immediate arrest, the officers told investigators, in part to avoid a high-speed chase. Mr. Smith said he and his friends turned their heads to the sound of a vehicle accelerating rapidly, headed southbound towards the street where Reinhold was walking. A second law enforcement SUV, which had been parked across from Mr. Smith's house, moved in with such speed that the friends thought they were witnessing a road rage incident or a gang shooting. Mr. Smith and Mr. Cutler ran after the unmarked SUVs, watching as they turned onto Mr. Reinhold's street, one cutting the corner and speeding over the grass. Nate Dingus, who according to Lieutenant Brady lived in the apartment where Reinhold was staying, said Mr. Reinhold was chewing a gummy worm as he approached his station wagon with a phone in one hand and a bag in the other. Mr. Dingus said in an interview that officers began jumping out of the vehicles before they had even come to a complete stop, and that one of them opened fire immediately, before any commands had been given. Another man who was walking his dog nearby said that a burst of about 10 gunshots began almost immediately after the SUVs came to a halt, and that he did not recall hearing any command. Mr. Lewis, who was on the other side of the scene, some 140 feet from Mr. Reinhold, also said the police opened fire immediately without giving any warnings, as did Mr. Smith and Mr. Cutler. Quote, "There was no get out of the car, there was no stop, there was no nothing. They just got out of the car and started shooting." So I wanted to read that whole thing. It was a little long to explain to you. Essentially, Reinhold was an Antifa activist, big supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement, who the Portland police, the federal government suspected of killing a Donald Trump supporter in Portland. A Donald Trump supporter who, by the way, was part of a white supremacist group. Reinhold told Vice News while he was in hiding, "I shot him in self-defense." I have no idea what happened. I don't know if he shot him in self-defense. I don't know if he shot him, in criminal homicide. I don't know. My hunch, based on knowing these Patriot Prayer people and these Proud Boys, my gut is he probably shot in self-defense. Putting that aside, Reinhold was the suspected shooter who killed the Trump supporter in Portland. So The U.S. Marshals were going in to arrest him. He was in hiding. But when you go in to arrest somebody, you generally don't jump out of the car before the car has stopped. You generally give commands that you are the police or you are the U.S. Marshals. You remember what happened with Breonna Taylor? They claim they announced themselves. What the New York Times reporting, and props to the New York Times in this case, good investigation. What they are reporting is that essentially Trump's U.S. Marshals rolled up and shot this guy dead, execution style, making no attempt to arrest him, making no attempt to even give him commands of who they were. This isn't one witness saying this. This is almost 24 witnesses said the U.S. Marshals didn't make any commands. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't try to arrest him. They just started shooting. And of course, like we've constantly for the last 30, 40, 50, however years, what's the rationale for that from the U.S. Marshals? Oh, we saw him have a gun. We saw him leaning towards a gun. According to the friend that he was staying with, he was walking, chewing, holding gummy worms and something else in the other hand. And don't believe me. Don't just take my word that they shot him execution style. I mean, that's what President Trump said. I already played it for you. President Trump literally said at his rally today that they didn't even try to arrest him. I'll play it for you one more time.
We sent in the U.S. Marshals. Took 15 minutes, it was over. 15 minutes, it was over. We got him. They knew who he was. They didn't want to arrest him. In 15 minutes, that ended. Anyway, and they called themselves peaceful protesters.
The law and order president. Hope you enjoyed that last video. Hop on over to statuscoup.com where you can sign up for our email list and become a member for as low as $5 to $10 a month. Membership is how we grow. That's statuscoup.com/join. And remember, join our email list so we can grow the revolution with you.